if you choose to attempt some of the things I'm going to talk about, we have great support. And Mike Parker and Steve McCartney and Marvin here that could just really be a benefit to you. Now, I don't expect I'm going to come back to North Carolina for another 10 years because that's about how often they invite me down here. So this is your one chance to really get a sense of what I'm trying to talk about and then try to implement it in your orchard, because 10 years from now, there may be a lot fewer of you here unless some of these concepts are applied on your farm. At least that's my opinion. This train that we were involved in New York particularly, took a turn towards high density in the late 70s, led by an extension specialist named Dick Norton. He introduced from Europe the concept of the pedestrian orchard, and it's called the slender spindle. And this is a picture of a beautiful slender spindle orchard. Every apple on the tree could be picked from the ground, not a single ladder. And there was a number of acres of this type of orchard planted in western New York in particular, maybe somewhere around 500 total acres. It was a boom. But there were two problems with this system. One is it was thought very expensive. We were putting a single wood post at every tree, and we were planting 600 trees to the acre. Who could afford 600 trees when they were $4 a tree back then? My experience with this was that it was a tremendous system, and we worked with it quite a bit early in my career. But as we got trees up to maturity, we noticed that they really could not give us the kinds of yields we were looking for. The yields maxed out at around 1,000 bushels to the acre. Now that's not bad, but we were looking for higher. And part of the reason is the amount of light that falls on the orchard floor. Because the trees are relatively short, and we still have to have 12 feet to drive tractors and move bins down the rows, we couldn't intercept more than about 50% of the available light that falls on that acre. And that limited our yields to about 900 to 1,000 bushels. So in 1988, in my efforts with the New York industry, I said, we've got to go back to taller trees. And so we moved quite strongly into the vertical axis system. We were wrongly, I think, worried about cost, so we went down from 600 trees to 500 trees to the acre, thought that was more reasonable in terms of cost, and went back to 10, 11, and 12-foot tall trees. Now, the concept of the vertical axis was a critical change in the apple industry because it moved us away from the central leader kind of tree, which had permanent tiers of branches, to renewal, pruning, and elimination of branches so that there were no permanent tiers. Now, we did modify the vertical axe for what we call the USA vertical axe, and we kept a bottom tier of permanent branches, but every other branch on that tree was temporary. And this is a key horticultural point that is driving almost everything we do now. If you never bought into that concept, it's time to get on the train. Renewal of branches is the basic horticultural pruning practice that we use on almost all modern high-density orchard systems. So we were okay for a couple of years with this idea, but starting in 1992, we began to have an itch to try higher and higher densities. And so we planted a trial at Bob and Eric Brown's orchard in western New York, where we considered densities all the way from 900, which was high, up to 2,000 trees per acre. Basically, that's 2 feet between trees by 10 feet between rows. And we started developing names. Of course, this very high density one at 2 feet by 10, 2,200 trees to the acre, we called super spindle. We had another one at 4 feet by 12, which we called slender axis, thinking, well, it's like a vertical axe, but more slender, because there was only 4 feet between trees at 908 trees to the acre. That system has morphed into what we now call the tall spindle, which I'm going to talk about considerably. This system, or this orchard systems trial, which was about 6 acres in size, was extremely beneficial to western New York. Growers came and looked at it. They said that'll never work at 2 feet by 10. Lo and behold, as yields started to come in and it was still manageable, after 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15 years, they said, wow, that's pretty interesting. We then planted a second experiment at Geneva at the experiment station in 1997, in which we compared all the way from 200 trees to the acre to 2,200 trees to the acre, basically a 10 by 18 in 2-foot increments or 1-foot increments down to 2 by 10, which is 2,000 trees to the acre. And this is the yield. It's been in the ground a long time, yields up to 2009. And several important things I want you to notice. The blue line on the bottom is the most widely spaced trees. They never caught up. Now this is one of the international slides, so it's in tons per hectare. But still, no matter what year those widely spaced trees, central leader trees, semi-dwarf on M7, could never catch up in yield to the high-density orchards. Now this is one of the beasts and one of the arguments I've had with people over the years. They said, well, we'll just wait till my central leader trees catch up and fully grow. They'll outdo your dwarf trees. They never do. Number two, the range or the arrangement of those lines goes basically from low density, medium density, higher, higher, higher to super high density. The super high density, that little brown line on the top, is generally on the top almost every year except a couple in here where it's sort of in the pack, indicating that those super high densities have the potential to yield substantially more than lower density. This is a horticultural basic principle that drives much of what we're doing. Now, very interesting to us, we've had what's typical of orchard, high yields, low yields. We had a couple of bad years, but in the last 7, 8 years, they've generally averaged. Now, 45 tons is 1,000 bushels to the acre. That's where we got to on the low density central leader, or 200 trees to the acre. But these higher densities have been somewhere up around 1,500 bushels to the acre average. So the potential average yield is higher with these higher density systems. When we look at this data summed up over 14, 15 years, this is the kind of curve that we get. Now, we had 4 varieties in this experiment: Empire, Fuji, Gale, and McIntosh. All the lines are kind of the same. McIntosh had a slightly lower line, but it basically shows that if you're down here at around 200 trees to the acre, which is around 600 trees to the hectare, you could accumulate about 300 tons over the years that we did this experiment. And if you go to higher and higher density, it goes up and up and up. And so the highest density could accumulate somewhere about 600 tons. The basic point is that you could almost double the bins of apples you produced on that acre over 15 years with just density, no matter what the variety was. That's worth a lot of money when you start to think about it. So this is kind of the situation we were in. Some of our growers said, yeah, we think that's true, but where is the optimum? Is it all the way up there at the 2,000 or 5,000 trees per hectare? Is it down here in the middle? What is it? And 1998 hit in New York, and maybe it was the same in North Carolina. Those were depressing years, 98, 99, 2000, 2001, and 2002. Prices were low. We had a lot of discouragement in our apple industry, and some people exited the business, said there's no future in this. But starting about 2001, one of the leaders in our industry organized what's called a strategic planning group. George Lamont. He involved several of us from Cornell, leaders in the industry, and said, what can we do to survive these low prices? And they basically came up with a plan of 3 points. That plan included, number one, we got to change the way we sell apples. We can't have 70, 80, 90 people in New York selling apples to 10 supermarket chains. They beat us down. When we don't sell them at the price they want, they go down the street from our neighbor. So they organized a cooperative called Premier Apple Cooperative, which now extends to many, many marketers in the eastern US, in which they can legally discuss price and hopefully keep the price up. And in reality, that one move has made a world of difference. Every year we estimate it adds $2 to $5 per box in price. The second point was we've got to deliver better apples to the consumer. And about that time is when MCP was just first being tested, and so the whole push was to get MCP into the business, deliver crisper, firmer apples. Now, we had tremendous problems with one of our main varieties, which is Empire. It's a great apple the day it comes out of CA storage. You pack it and then you ship it, but by the time the consumer gets it, it's soft. MCP changed that apple. It's just a fabulous apple when the consumer eats it. And it's done that for many, many varieties. Now, we got other problems with MCP I'm not going to go into here, but that was the second major point. The third major point, they said, Terrence, figure out the best system for us so that we can replant, retool, plant better varieties, newer varieties. We have to change this industry. And so we began a serious economic study of what we should do. And we used all this data we've collected for almost 20 years to try to put together this one slide. And this one slide has helped us focus our efforts in New York on what we should be doing in terms of planting. It's really a slide that shows what is the optimum planting density in terms of profitability of an orchard over 20 years. On the bottom here, again, is trees per acre, and here is net present value of the orchard for a 20-year life. If you plant an orchard, and what density are you going to make the most money? The slide is instructive. Now, in 2003, when we first did the study, this is the black line, it showed that if you plant relatively low density orchards, somewhere around 300 trees to the acre, which is a 10 by 16 or something, it was still possible to make money. The number is positive. over 20 years, you could still make money in the apple business. Some people said, okay, I'm going to not get on that high density train Robinson's preaching because I can still make money. However, the slide also showed that there's a very steep part to this curve, and you can increase profitability over 20 years from somewhere around $7,000 net present value to the acre to somewhere around 15. That's a doubling of the profitability by going up to somewhere 900 to 1,000 trees to the acre. But then it looked like if you went higher and higher density, you didn't gain anything. So although our high density orchard experiments had shown 2 feet by 10, 2,000 trees to the acre could be managed. It was very fun to do. The type of pruning is so simple and it's just a great system. It was not more profitable than a more moderate density. With this sort of information, we then said we've got to focus our efforts right in this area, around 1,000 trees to the acre. And so we started developing a package of management systems, strategies, and we came up with this other name. We call it the tall spindle, which is focused in this area of planting density, and we've been pushing it ever since. Now, in that same economic study, I just put in one more slide here. And this was really humbling to me because it showed that no matter what I do in orchard systems, it's the price that you sell apples for that makes a big difference. This is 3 different curves showing prices at a relatively low price, $6 return back to the farm. We lose money no matter what density, and the more trees we plant per acre, the more money we lose. And so in this particular case, if you want to lose only a little money, plant low density. But if prices are higher, $8 return per bushel back to the farm, or $10, then the curve takes this familiar shape with an optimum somewhere or around 800, 900, 1,000 trees to the acre, and not much gain beyond that. Now, maybe for you, it was like us in 2012. We had a weird year for prices. We had Honeycrisp selling for $1,000 a bin. You know, it's huge. That's $40 a box back to the farm. Now, if I put that curve up there, it's going to show high density is worth tremendous amount of money, but the scale is off the chart. But the important point to me was, if I convince a guy who's getting mediocre prices to go from low density to high density, I can help him. But he would do much better to just switch to something he can sell for high prices. Now maybe there are no options. Some growers feel like there's no, but for us, in New York, there's been at least 3 tremendous good options. Gala has performed that role where prices have gone from $5 to $6 a box to 10 with Gala. Honeycrisp has been way off the charts, and those 2 things have really been the basis for the resurgence of the New York apple industry. So I acknowledge the fact that price drives and trumps everything, but nevertheless, when you're sitting down to think about the future of your farm, being able to retool, change your varieties, put new orchards in, get rid of the old orchards, has a tremendous potential to change the profitability of your business. Now, I want to focus on that point just for one more minute. If you're happy growing, I should keep my mouth shut. I offend people all the time. But don't take offense, please. If you're happy growing Romes at 12 by 20 and you're still making a little bit of money, what you don't realize is the money you could have made if you could switch. It's the money you don't see, that opportunity cost that you could have made, that's huge. And that's what so many of our farmers in New York have been able to do. Now, starting in 2003, things turned around. Prices improved, people started planting, Honeycrisp came in, Gala came in, Fuji came in. People started making money. They just poured that money right back into their business. It's been unbelievable to me, the number of new orchards planted, all of this 1,000 trees to the acre, the number of new storages, new packing lines. It's just a tremendous resurgence. It wouldn't have been possible if they hadn't had some years of good profitability. Now, I know 2012 was a bad, tough year, but we just have to ignore that for the moment. The point being is I think there's opportunities in the apple business, but they are slightly different types of orchards than maybe what you've grown in the past. Now, some of you have been on this train, you've followed, you went to central leader trees, and you went to something higher vertical axe, and maybe you're now planting tall spindle. For those of you that haven't, let me give you a refresher course in how to do this, because it's so dang simple. Since the late 1990s, we basically coined this term tall spindle. It's all based on M9, but I will pause here and say there's tremendously better rootstocks coming up, and Mike's going to talk about new rootstocks later, so I won't talk about them today, even though they're my love. I hope he talks good about the Geneva rootstocks, because if he doesn't, I don't know what I'm doing. Not too much pressure on you, Mike. But basically it's a tall tree, very thin, very narrow. The rootstock could be M9 for us, that works beautifully. For people with high fire blight potential, maybe they have to switch to a disease-resistant, fire blight-resistant Geneva rootstock. But the system is very simple in that there's a central trunk, and on that trunk we only allow small fruiting branches by eliminating larger diameter branches on a regular basis. And we limit the height to a certain height that is defined by how wide the rows are. And so typically we don't want rows wider than 12 feet. Could be 11 feet. We sometimes fudge and go up to 13. But that generally gives us a tree height somewhere about 10, 11, or 12 feet. So unfortunately it still has to have a ladder. It's not a pedestrian orchard. But by doing that, we've been able to go up in yield to the 1,500 to 1,800 bushel range. Sometimes they look like little soldiers just packed right in there in a row. Now, I know that every one of you is on a different page as far as what I'm talking about today. So if I say some things that seem like old hat and review, just bear with me. Sometimes when I talk about this to people for the first time, they just can't comprehend that you could make a tree stay within that spacing of 3 feet by 12 is the one spacing I like the most. And they take me out to one of their orchards and they say, hey, here's a gala tree on M9. You see how big it got? I never could have fit that thing in 3 feet. Well, that might be true, because if you planted that gala tree at 7 feet between and a vertical axe system, it essentially grows to fill the space. You left big branches in there. It's got branches that have grown to fill the space. But if you plant that same tree at 3 feet and you never allowed a single big branch to ever develop because you cut them out and only allow small fruiting branches, it stays small. And that concept, once it clicks in your mind, changes everything. We can manage tree size over this vast range by the way we manage branches. The principles of the tall spindle system are the following. Number one, we try to plant with enough investment in the ground to maximize profitability, but no more. In our analysis, that seems to be somewhere around 1,000 trees to the acre. Now, for some of you, that will seem extreme. Trees are costing $7 times 1,000. You're going to pay $7,000 to the nurseryman per every acre you plant. Many of you will say, I can't afford it. But I'm here to try to convince you that if you can make that investment, even on a small percentage of your acreage, it pays itself back in big ways many, many times over. And so that's the optimum that we think. 900 to 1,300 trees per acre, depending on rootstock, soil, variety. But what that gives you is the potential to have very high early production. Now, we've set some targets for New York growers to produce 3,300 bushels in the first 5 years. The only way that's possible is if you plant highly feathered trees. And by the way, we've gotten some tremendously beautiful feathered trees from nurseries in the last 5 years. And then you do minimal pruning on those highly feathered trees. That 3,300 bushels, if it's a variety that's high priced, pays the entire investment. And it happens quick. So if you're 69 years old or 90 years old and you say, I'm too old to plant trees, all you need is 3-4 years and you'll be in the money. You can never say, in my mind, you're too old, you want to stand pat with your orchard and not replant. Third point, this system leads to relatively high early yield, high mature yields, because it intercepts higher percentage of available light, upwards of 70 to 75%. So in the past, in New York, we basically said if we could get 1,000 bushels to the acre, we're happy. With this system, we basically want to shoot for 1,400 bushels to the acre with Gala, almost up to 2,000 bushels to the acre with Fuji, with some of these very high yielding varieties. The fourth point is that this system, because it's so narrow, so thin, leads to extremely good fruit quality. It has this very thin, narrow canopy. There's no permanent branches on the tree. We take out the big branches. The small branches allow for better light penetration around the branch and near the fruit. We have sort of a little rule that we sometimes try to tell people, and that is we prune by looking on the tree for any branch that's about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and that's a candidate to be removed when they're planted at 3 feet by 12. If you do that routinely every year, the tree never outgrows that space because all the branches that are on the tree are relatively small. We also typically try to simplify or columnarize each of the branches that remains. I liken that to a branch with an arm with fingers. You can grow branches, and they eventually produce side branches that I call fingers. In this, we want to cut off all the fingers, leaving only one, just a branch with a single axis. That then leads to good light distribution around the fruit and very good fruit quality. And of course, balanced trees. Now I want to comment briefly about this. The more south you go in the United States production area from New York, more south, vigor becomes a greater problem. And so I realize that and I understand that. But nevertheless, there are techniques that allow you to manage that vigor with crop load, planting the graft union up out of the ground, using the most dwarfing rootstocks possible that are disease resistant. So for example, if you were to choose something like Geneva 11, which is one of our more dwarfing rootstocks, with something like Gala, I think it can be managed quite well at this kind of densities of around 1,000 trees to the acre. Now in the last 5 years, what's become important to our growers is that this system, because it's a simple pruning recipe and very simple tree canopy design, allows for improved labor efficiency. That's being accomplished primarily through this very simple pruning recipe. I can send a pruning crew through a tall spindle orchard with ladders, and it'll be done quicker than a more central leader type of system. But more importantly, we've adopted the use of motorized platforms, self-steering platforms, to reduce pruning costs, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, with generally somewhere between a 30 and 40% reduction in labor cost. How do we achieve this? It's extremely simple, so don't get your minds wrapped up in that this is very, very complex. We generally want to start with a highly feathered tree, and here I show 4 different types of trees. A whip, a feathered tree where I tipped all the feathers and cut the leader, the same feathered tree where I didn't tip and didn't cut, but I bent the branches down, and then a tree that has 20 or 18 short, weak feathers that I didn't do anything to. This particular tree will probably produce no apples in the second year. This one has a potential to produce about 5 fruits in the second year. This one has a potential to produce 10 to 15 in the second year, and this one 20 to 50 in the second year. Well, what does that mean? Unfortunately, this is really too dark of a picture with these lights on. But that is a Brookfield Gala tree on G41 we put in one of our trials in 2006. In 2007, the second leaf, it had 40 apples. 40 apples times 1,000 trees to the acre was about 300 bushels to the acre in the second leaf. This is the potential. This is a different picture for Fuji on a different Geneva rootstock called Geneva 007 at 85 fruits in the second year. Now I'm pointing to the height of the tree that was delivered from the nursery. So this is a beautiful nursery tree, taller than I am. In the first year, it grew from my fingertip to that point. In the second year, that's what it grew, and it loaded up with 85 apples. Now, times 3,000 trees per hectare, which is 3 feet by 12. I should have changed this tons. It's 43 tons. That's 950 bushels to the acre in the second leaf. Does that sink in? The potential is tremendous. Now you have a better chance of hitting that than we do in New York because you can grow a tree faster. But to get this, they planted a beautiful tree and they bent the branches down soon after planting to induce flowering in the second year, plus they had it on M9, on one of these Geneva rootstocks, which is extremely precocious. So what do we do? When we plant a tree that comes highly feathered, now unfortunately the US nurseries tend to deliver us this kind of tree, and it's hard to see there, but it has fairly strong side branches. And then they tip it to get it in the shipping box. So it's not ideal. But what we have ended up doing is taking off 1 or 2 of the biggest feathers, like this one my clipper's on, it's even taller than the leader, or this one coming straight towards you. But all the rest we tie down below horizontal soon after planting to limit their growth so they don't become scaffold branches. And secondly, to induce flowering on them. We don't tip the leader. Now the one biggest change in apple tree management at planting is this. You, like me, cut our teeth on heading trees when we plant them. But that's not what we do. The single biggest change in what we do now is we do not head trees. And if you could make that one change in planting new orchards at this spacing, it will help you a long ways to becoming successful. So here's a picture of a couple of different types of trees. This is a tree that had 3 really strong branches on it that were taller than the leader itself. We ended up cutting those off, but all the rest we tied down. And there's many different ways to do that tying down, and we'll show some of them in the orchard tomorrow. Even better would be to plant this tree. This is a honeycrisp tree on M9 in which it has 18 short little feathers. We don't need to do anything. Stick that tree in the ground, 3 feet between the trees, and it's going to flower next year. Unfortunately, we still continue to get trees that are whips. What do you do with a whip? We say, don't head them. Plant the whip. Leave it 5 feet tall. Hopefully you're not planting trees that are smaller caliper than ½ inch. Don't accept those. But if you get a whip that's ½ inch, 5/8, plant it, but don't head it. And I'll show you in a minute what I want you to do with that. Now, this issue of tying down branches is sometimes viewed as a big job, labor, too much labor. I don't want to get out there and do that. But this is the reason we push this idea at least the year you plant the trees. If you plant a highly feathered tree and you leave the branches in their natural angle, by the end of that year, each one of those branches has grown, it's gotten thick, it's starting to become a scaffold branch. Also, the leader has grown, but not as much as we want because there's competition. The tall spindle system doesn't have scaffolds. It doesn't have permanent branches, only small fruiting branches. If, however, you take that same feathered tree and soon after planting you tie all the feathers down, what you get is those feathers don't grow very much, they don't get thick in caliper, and the leader grows a little more. So you start right off the bat getting the tall, narrow, conical, tall spindle tree. This is an example. This tree is at the end of the first year in the orchard, but we tied those branches down about 3 weeks after planting. Now, it was a beautiful tree. Every one of those came from the nursery. There's more than 10. There's 12 of them on that tree. Tying them down at the end of the first year. We didn't do anything else at the end of the second year. This is kind of what it looks like. It's not the same tree, but it's a gala. But you see, here we have relatively small fruiting branches, and we're able to crop it in the second year, and now we're set up to crop this one again in the third year. Contrast that with this. This is that same tree that's in the third year where they were tied down in the first year. This is a tree in that same experiment where we didn't tie any branches down. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 relatively strong branches. What are you going to do with those? They don't fit at a 3 foot between tree spacing. So you have to come in and you have to cut out 1, 2, 3 before I ever got any apples off of those branches. I grew the branches, but now I didn't get any fruit. So this concept of spending a little time on the year of planting, getting the feathers down, allows you to keep these feathers for 4 or 5 or 6 years before you start to have to renew them. You pick a bunch of apples off of them, and the tree then does not outgrow that space given to it. The pruning system of this tall spindle is so simple. Every year you look up and down the tree and you say, is there a branch that seems too big? Is it bigger than 3/4 inch in diameter? If it is, it's a candidate to removal. Now, you don't have to take it out, but we take out every year 1 to 3. So this year I'd take out this one I've circled, or maybe that one, or just this one. Next year I come back, I look for the same thing. Now, the concept of tying down is one that some people have a hard time dealing with. And I just show here a picture of a beautiful orchard. It's about 50 acres planted total over 2 years, and they tied down every single feather. This is midsummer of the first year. The leader's up to here. We've tied down all those feathers from the nursery. Second year, tremendous crop, and they just went forward. Now, another critical point of this system is you got to grow a tree. If you can't grow a tree, don't even try it. If your tree just runs out because you don't manage them well, it's a very expensive way, very good way to lose money. But if you can grow a tree because you can push it with fertilization and you can irrigate and all the things that we require to grow trees, you can do extremely well. For example, this is Gala on M9. We've reached the top wire, which is 10 feet at the end of the second year. So the tree was about 5.5 feet when we planted it. The first year we grew it about 2 feet, the third year about 3 feet. So we're over 10 feet by the end of the second year. That's the target I would set for you. Go look at any of your orchards. At the end of the second year, are you close to that wire at 10 feet? Now, this is honeycrisp. We didn't achieve it. They're about right here. There's the top wire. It's just a much more difficult variety to get to grow and reach the top wire. Maybe we needed a different rootstock than M9, slightly more vigorous with honeycrisp. But nevertheless, if you can achieve that, you're well on your way. Now, I put up this slide because with my growers, I say growing a tall spindle tree is just like so easy. It's like falling out of bed. I don't know why people sweat it so much. It just happens. Let me show you how. Start with a highly feathered tree. I should have blocked out that nursery name, I'm sorry. Tie branches down soon after planting. Plant them 3 feet between trees, 12 feet between rows. Grow the tree with irrigation. This is the end of the second year. You see it's above the wire. Now this is the end of the 3rd year. Same tree, it just filled out a little more. And then this is a mature tree, ready for pruning with that one branch there to be eliminated. The reason this just happens, if you just do the first job of tying branches down, second job of growing the tree, third job of starting to take out about year 3, year 4, whichever branch seems big. Maybe one branch in year 4 and then come back 1 and 5, 1 and 6, 2 and 7. All of a sudden, all the big branches are gone, and what you have is a dominant trunk with only small branches. Now remember, I forgot to mention that every time we take out a branch, we leave a stub with an angle cut, about an inch long stub to get a replacement shoot out of the thing. And that process then leads to just very high yields. Now this is one that I like to put up because this is in New York, this is from the Hudson Valley. Bob Anderson will recognize the Shangung Mountains in the background. It's Gale, and it's Fuji on M9 in the 4th leaf. And we achieved 2,000 bushels to the acre. You can see the trees are just packed in there every 3 feet. Beautiful canopy developed over the first 4 years. You can pay off a lot of bills with this kind of production. So we've set for our growers some targets. And I would set the same goal for you. Try this system. Try doing everything exactly the way I said. Try an acre. See if you can make this happen. Now it's not so easy to do. These targets, 300 bushels in the 2nd leaf, 600 bushels in the 3rd leaf, 1,000 bushels the acre in the 4th leaf, 1,400 bushels the acre in the 5th leaf, add up to 3,300 bushels the acre. This is one of our experiments showing tree density. Now this is in trees per hectare, but basically the only time we could get up to this level, which is 3,300, 150 tons, was somewhere around 3,000 trees to the acre. If you plant less, if you're still planting 500 trees, 600 trees, you will never achieve this kind of yield because you have to have trees per acre. But if you take the leap and you plant this kind of system and everything goes right and you never get a frost and all those other things, you know, like New York, we never get frost except for 2012. You can achieve this kind of thing. Now I've promised the first, not anybody, who can prove that they did this, I buy them a steak dinner. And I'll make the same commitment to you. The first guy in North Carolina to show me on records that he's achieved 3,000, I'll lower it from 3,300, just 3,000 bushels over the first 5 years. Marvin and I will buy him a steak dinner. Just a picture of beautiful gala trees in the 3rd leaf with about 800 bushels the acre on them. Okay. Now one of the common mistakes and one of the challenges is sometimes these trees want to put on more apples than what is desirable. So it's very important to manage crop load in year 2, 3, 4, and 5 to not overcrop them so that they don't go into biennial bearing. And we've developed this little ruler. Valent actually makes them for us. It's called the Cornell hand thinning gauge, and I'm sure you can get them from somebody in Valent. But basically it has these semicircles. You go out to your tree in year 2, you put it on the trunk about a foot above the ground and find the right size. And then it'll tell you in these little numbers how many apples you should leave, because often you can set more apples than what is desirable. And if you set more apples than desirable, you end up getting too little growth, and the trees don't get to 10 feet tall so quick, and then you sacrifice yields later. So this thing is based to help you manage crop to the proper levels in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these are sort of the targets. Generally, we're looking for around 20 apples in year 2, 40 in 3, 80, 120 in year 5. If you grow the tree less well than what typically we expect, this will still tell you leave less apples. If you grow the tree better and the trunk is bigger, you can leave more apples. And so it's a very useful guide, very easy to use. So on young trees, we want to adjust the crop load to just the right number of fruit. And we've developed this small little ruler guide that tells us how many apples we should leave based upon the diameter of the trunk. So the way to use this is we just find the right diameter semicircle about a foot off the ground, and we find the right one that fits the size of that trunk, which is this one right here. And then there's 2 numbers on it, H and G number. The H stands for Honeycrisp, the G is for Gala. And this one says we should have, since it's a Fuji, it's more like Gala, we should have about 68 apples on the tree. And that's a guide then when we hand thin to determine how many apples to leave on the tree. Now let me go back and say, some of you will be receiving from the nurseries less than ideal trees, the whips. Sometimes whips can be very good if it's a really high quality tree 5/8 caliper whip. But the problem we have is people want to head that to start that first tier of branches. But this is a different system. There are no first tier of branches. There are no scaffold branches on this tree. And so the method that we've developed to manage the trees, when we get a whip, bear in mind, it's less than ideal. You'll never get the yields out of the whip that you would have got out of a feathered tree. But if that's what you end up with, don't head the tree. But about 20 days after you plant the tree, after it's started to wake up and there's a movement, a little bit of bud growth, spray Maxell, which is a branch-inducing agent, about 500 to 1,000 parts per million. I find the more north we go, 500 parts works well. The more south we go, you need more. And so, trial and error, you can figure out whether you're between 500, 750, or 1,000. It's not so expensive. We take a little backpack sprayer, you can use a little spray bottle, walk up and down the row and spray that leader everywhere from knee height up to the tip with Maxell on both sides. And that chemical then induces lateral bud development, and we can get branching without heading. We then come in just a few weeks, about a week later, and we remove bud number 2, 3, and 4 up near the tip. We leave the tip bud, but we remove, just rub them out, 2, 3, and 4, because they always have narrow crotch angles. But the ones that start below have wider angles. Then we continue to use clothespins or toothpicks, and then the following year, we will tie those branches we grew the first year down, like we would have on a feathered tree in the first year. But you can still make a tremendously good tall spindle orchard starting with whips. You're just a little bit like 1 year delayed in the production side of it. Now, one of the common errors that I see happening around New York and other places is that as trees start to get older, people leave too large of a branch in the tree. Now, I show here on the left-hand side a tall spindle tree. It's about 9 years old, and this branch over here looks like it's sticking out too far in that one. So these would be the 2 candidate branches to remove this winter. By removing those, it stays very narrow in the top. And that's key to this system, keeping the top narrow. Here you see a pruned tree. And one of the things I want to emphasize is how simple it is. I just gave a big talk in New York about what are we doing in 2012 after we lost the crop, or 2013 after losing the crop in 12. One of the things I was telling them, we got to prune more aggressively because we're going to be loaded up with buds like crazy. But that plays into this point. A tall spindle tree is a simple tree. It doesn't have a lot of branches. Because there's so many trees per acre, you don't have to have a lot of branches. Now, little calculations we do are, let's calculate how many apples we need per acre and then how many we need per tree. It turns out on the tall spindle tree, if you have about 125 apples, you have 1,500 bushels to the acre. It's not a lot of apples, 125. So we basically tell growers we need about 15 little fruiting branches. If each one of those had about 10 apples, you get your 150. You can get 125 as 1,500. So 150 is more than you need. Then you can hand thin a little bit. So when we prune, we eliminate big branches and we leave small branches, but we don't leave 30 of them. We try to leave 15. One of the big mistakes is this. People leave a relatively strong side branch for 2 or 3 years. It gets thick, almost the same diameter as the leader. Then they want me to help them spread it down. But that's really not the point of this. We're going to do some tying down in that first year, and after that we don't want to do any tying down unless we're forced to. Much better would be not to allow this branch to develop, to identify it very early. And then here you see on the bottom a more mature tall spindle planting with one big branch. Taking away that one branch was very beneficial. And here you see one that was taken away the last year with the replacement shoot that grew. Now I put in this slide of data just to prove the point that I was trying to make earlier. That when you plant trees far apart, even on M9, they grow to fill the space. And you get bigger trees, bigger trunks. And people say that never would have fit at a 3-foot spacing. But when you plant them closer, then they're smaller trees. This is some data over 10 years showing the trunk cross-sectional area based on tree density. If we plant them at low density of around 200 trees to the acre, in this case about 600 per hectare, for these particular 4 varieties, Macintosh is the most vigorous, we got trunks that were about, I can't even read the number, 80 square centimeters. Those are pretty big trunks after 10 years. They're like that. If we planted that same M9 tree on Macintosh, but closer and closer and closer together, this is 3 feet between trees and this is 2 feet between trees. Let's just look at 2 feet. The trunks only were about 22 square centimeters in size, much smaller trunks. So it was about 1/3 the size just based upon how close we planted them and how we pruned them. These particular trees never had a big branch ever in them. As it developed, we cut it out. And so they also cropped very heavily. So the tree was putting all its resources into fruit every year and we never got big trees. Now this is the point I want to drive home here, that you won't be afraid to try this in North Carolina. I know North Carolina is not New York. Vigor's more of a problem here. But if you can find the right rootstock that'll give you moderate growth, manage branches in the early years by tying them down, then crop the heck out of the thing, cut out big branches, you can be very successful with this system. Now, next I'm going to show you a small video of pruning. This is pruning in New York, mature tall spindle. Some of you may have seen this before, but I love this video because it opens people's eyes to the way we prune. These two guys, by the way, are two Mexicans. Jaime, the guy I'm going to focus on, was picked up about a year ago by immigration, and he's no longer in the U.S., and he's the best pruner in the world. But immigration wouldn't care about that. They're standing on little platforms on a tractor-driven motorized platform system in little cages, one on each side of the tree. Let's see what it looks like. This is Jaime. He's pruning with loppers 4 feet up above the ground at the top of the tree. He's going to make a tall spindle tree simple. He's pruning Gala. Okay, here we come up with a very vigorous one. What the heck's he going to do? It's gone wild on us. Just going to rip out a lot of those suckers. He's going to leave the stuff that's spurred up. It's going to be relatively simple. Now, he has a rule that it has to fit underneath this steel bar because otherwise it's too tall. So he'll chop the top to a side branch. He works at this pace all day long. This is a tractor. Nobody's driving the tractor. He's driving it with a little button right here that steers it. Takes out a big branch. Look at how simple this tree ends up when he's done. And cuts the top. Okay, here we go. Oh, you got to steer for a sec. Couple of big branches. You just look for those. Once you see them, what are left are the smaller diameter wood. Now this is Gala, where we also include a fourth rule. Once in a while we'll shorten up the tips of long branches that have too small a wood. Okay, look how simple this ends up. There's not a lot of branches in the top, but there's enough to have 125 apples per tree. Now the other, this is a two-row pruner. The other guys, they're not as good. They're slower, they don't know what they're doing. Let's go back to Jaime. Okay, what's he going to do on this tree? He's going to take the top off. He decided to keep that. I probably would have taken it out, but he's going to take out that one. So now it still looks really, really nice. Some of these, if he had time, he'd shorten them up, but others he wouldn't. Now there's a problem here. That branch is kind of ugly, but he kept this part here that had a little bit of good fruity wood. What's he going to do here? A couple of big branches. Once he gets rid of that, look how beautiful the tree looks. He could have gotten rid of that, but he decides to keep it and just take it off and leave some fruiting spurs. But he did shorten it up. Now this is his one big mistake. Focus on, oh, I hate that cut right there. It was an upright branch, and he just left it stubbed back. Should have just taken it all the way out. But other than that, it's almost a perfect pruning job. The one point about this video is that it shows the simpleness of the tall spindle pruning. You take out whole limbs, and what you leave are the small limbs. By the way, there's nobody in that tractor. Now, I don't know if this is OSHA approved, because this is a farmer-built machine. It's just a beautiful, beautiful concept. And hopefully we've seen enough now, we can go on. Well, I miss Jaime. But let's go on for you. If we're to try to summarize what this system entails, now bear in mind, this system is designed to make you money. Now, I say again, if you're happy the way you are, that's fine with me. But I think there's money on the table in the apple business if you can change, plant new varieties, get into these high-density systems that yield more. If you do, it's very simple. Once the tree is mature, we have 3 simple rules that we use to prune this. The first is every year we limit the height of the tree by cutting to some little side branch at the optimum tree height. Now that optimum tree height is defined as 90% of the row spacing. So here you see, this all looks pretty uniform, like almost somebody cut it every year. And they did. Every year they find a place to cut it, and in this particular case, 11 feet tall. If the row spacing is 12 feet between rows, 90% of that is about 11 feet. Rule number 2, look for 1 or 2 branches every year, or maybe 3, that you'll cut out that are large. Now they're not large in the traditional sense, they're basically about 1 inch in diameter or bigger. Now this is what we call the 2-cut rule. If you prune more than that, sometimes you over prune. But by doing this every year, you can stay on a cycle and the tree never gets a lot of big branches. Now I want to emphasize that remember that when you leave large branches, it creates large trees. That's why some trees that are planted 6 feet apart fill that space. Those large branches export carbohydrates to the root and make the tree big. The third rule is a simple one of simplifying or columnarizing each one of the branches that remain after you take out 2 or 3. So remember, cut off the fingers, leave just a single axis, find the best axis to cut to, and then leave that there. And then next year, if that branch is too big, you'll take it out. That gives you the best fruit quality because you get the best light distribution. So that's the basic message. There's a whole nother aspect that I could talk about that is sort of what's new. What are we doing? We've been doing this tall spindle for a lot of years, but more recently we've been trying to move to less expensive ways to manage this tall spindle. And that involves moving to motorized platforms for pruning, hand thinning, and potentially harvesting. What's different? Well, in the past we've used a lot of these. This happens to be a New Zealand hydroladder, but we use a lot of brownies, tricycle type things. But you have one man you're moving and you're working off of complex trees. Now the idea is to move several men at a certain speed on very simple trees like you saw with the video with Jaime. There's a tremendous number of different ideas on these platforms. Some of them grower built, just a bin trailer. Others have this 2-row system with men hanging in cages. These kind of multi-level platforms. Factory built platforms from Italy. This one is a $50,000 machine. Or factory built from Phil Brown. There's also some really interesting grower innovations in New York I just wanted to mention. This is a 2-row system just built on the tractor. And this is a single-row system which just built right on the hood of the tractor. There's a couple $1,000 compressor on the back. Platform you can make yourself. These tether bars so your OSHA won't get mad at you. And then they put a little motor on the steering wheel which you control with a little button in your pocket. 2 guys stand up here with pneumatics. Just go down the row. It's extremely inexpensive, but the efficiency is reduced pruning costs of these tall spindles by about 40%. It's another little machine invented. This is a nursery digging machine. They just built this thing on it. They can do 4 rows at once. It's tying leaders. Each guy has a rubber band system. We'll show tomorrow where he ties. And they do things really efficiently. The big cost is, of course, harvest labor. As one of the machines we're developing in New York with the Waffler family, which I think has a tremendous potential, is a way to increase harvest labor efficiency and not require so many people. What we're trying to do, we've got the system that makes a lot of money. Now how can we reduce the cost? And this is sort of a figure you can look at later that shows we're investing about 280 hours per acre on a traditional vertical axis system of labor, both to prune it, train the trees, manage the trees, and then pick it. This is with the tall spindle system. This is at 1,000 bushels to the acre. If we go up to 1,500 bushels to the acre, we can do it for less hours if we utilize some of this mechanization work that we're working on. Let me end with this, just conclusions. We basically push our growers to plant the tall spindle system, even those that will go kicking and screaming. I tell them, what you plant this year, you're going to live with for 20 years. You're married to it. Some of the advances that we're going to see over the next 20 years, you won't be able to take advantage of if you continue with traditional widely spaced trees. These more simple trees will be more adaptable to partial mechanization, lower costs, higher yields, and better fruit quality. Many places in the world are going in this direction. With that, I thank you very much for your attention.
This has been a production of BRCC TV, the education channel, in conjunction with the North Carolina Cooperative Extension, empowering people, providing solutions.